Hi. Last year was a big year for me. I had two major surgeries. I was diagnosed with cancer. There's no sign of it now so far, praise the Lord. And I found I had a bunch of other smaller medical conditions, and now I take pills for them every day. And I just remember saying several times to people, I feel like last year I was young, and this year I'm old. So all that got me thinking about the nature of sickness and the nature of God as a healer. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has me thinking about it again. So I want to take a couple weeks to think a little bit about what it means that God is a healer. Uh, some of you, by the way, face a lot worse than I did. I know some of you are in chronic pain every single day you wake up. I know that some of you have a disability that you live with constantly. So what does it mean for you or for me or for anybody that God is a healer? Okay, I know one thing it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that you automatically can claim healing any moment of your life and say, I have to be in perfect health now. I also know this. It definitely doesn't mean that you should feel guilty for not being healed yet. Sometimes people with chronic pain somehow feel like it's their fault, or they don't have enough faith, or God is punishing them, or something. I don't know what. But we don't have to feel that way. Sometimes God heals right away, and sometimes He doesn't. And we shouldn't guilt or shame each other or ourselves for that. But whether you're facing something chronic or whether you've had surgeries like I had, or if you're just ordinary person or annoyed by everyday ailments, the question I have is, what does it mean that God is a healer by nature, which I believe is biblical and true? So I have a couple things to suggest this week, and then I'll suggest maybe a couple things next week. The first thing it means to me this week is it means that I need to remember to see God as bigger than my own experiences. If my life is for a time all about sickness or all about pain, I can begin to get tunnel vision and to feel as though God is somehow like what I'm experiencing, when in reality He's completely different. Did you know that in the Old Testament law, God's holiness is associated with health and life and wholeness? There's all these ceremonial codes about when they could approach God and how they could approach Him and everything else. So in the middle of all those, there's some very odd things. A lot of those codes were concerned about corpses, surprising number of them. If you touched a corpse, for example, even accidentally, then you were banned for a while from going into the sanctuary. There were priests, they weren't even allowed to be near a dead body. They wouldn't even been allowed to attend a funeral for anybody other than their own immediate family. They just weren't supposed to go near death at all. If someone got leprosy or other kinds of skin diseases, they were not allowed near the tabernacle. That wasn't just about contagion, it was also showing something else. If a priest was born blind or lame or with a disfigurement, he wasn't allowed to serve as a priest. So, what's with all this? Um, Obviously, God wasn't saying that He didn't want to be near lepers or that He didn't value the service of blind people. That's not at all what He was getting at. These rules didn't have anything to do with the value of the people. They didn't have anything to do with whether God loved people or didn't love them or anything like that. What was going on is these rules about the ceremonies were being used to paint a picture for Israel of the holiness of God. And part of that picture was that there is no death in God. There is no sickness in God. God is life and health and perfection and wholeness. So the idea here is that God is a healer because God is health itself. God is by nature life and health. Sickness and death, even though they can be judgments from God, are more of an indication of what God isn't than what God is. But life and health and wholeness and perfection, those are indications of what God is. So they were being taught to say God is much different than our regular human lives. God is much different than our everyday experiences. And I'm the same way. I need to remember, if I'm in a season of my life when I seem to be constantly looking in the face of sickness and struggle and physical pain and uncertainty about how long I'll live and things like that, or whatever. I need to, of course, I have as much value to God as I ever had still. But I also need to remember that God is bigger than what I'm seeing. The circumstances in that time are presenting me a false picture of reality, a false picture of God. And that can be important to remember. So that's one thing it means that God is by nature a healer, is that God is by nature health and life and wholeness. And God is nothing like the way we experience life. He's much bigger, much grander, much better than that. The second thing is this. Um, you do know, if you're in chronic pain, for example, or if you have a serious disability, you do know, don't you, that one day you will be healed. That's called the physical resurrection of the body. That's a promise to every Christian. Now, what will those new bodies be like? I have no idea. Paul didn't either, but here's what he said about it. He said, so also is the resurrection of the dead. It's sown a perishable body. It's raised an imperishable body. It's sown in dishonor. It's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness. It's raised in power. So whatever our new bodies will be like, we know they're going to be full of life and health and strength and power. My wife has told me that she doesn't think there's ever a time when she just woke up feeling physically good. I mean, that she just struggles with a kind of a general ache and pain in her body, that she never wakes up feeling really good all the time. In the resurrection, she will, as we all will. So I used to say, you know, it might not, as a Christian, it might not be God's will for you to be healed. But I don't say that anymore. What I say now is it might not be God's will for you to be healed right now. But I know for sure that it is God's will for you to be healed, because it is the destiny of every Christian that we will participate in that resurrection. It's the destiny of every Christian that we will be given full life and health. It's just a matter of the timing. So what does it mean that God's a healer? It means that that's my destiny, and that's yours too as a child of God, to find full life and health one day. Now, might he also give it today? Of course. But if he doesn't, it just means we're waiting a little bit. That makes a difference. Don't forget how long eternity is. If in 5 million years we're sitting around trying to remember how long this life was, it'll probably seem to us like just a blip on the screen. We will say there's been so much of living with God that's been living in fullness and health and wholeness in life. Just a little bit that didn't seem like that for a few years. So it matters that God's a healer, because that's our destiny. When it says by his stripes we are healed, it's very much partly referring to the fact that we will be resurrected one day, physically made completely right, finally. So don't be afraid if you are suffering with something to ask God for healing. I don't think you can demand it at a certain time, but it's certainly in line with his character and with his goals for us. But suppose, especially if you have something chronic, and you ask, and you do ask, and have asked, and he hasn't answered you yet. Suppose that's true for me. How do I live now if I still struggle with ongoing physical suffering? So even in that case, I can still show the glory of God in my weakness. So health and life, they paint a picture of the nature of God, but sickness and pain and struggle, they paint a picture of our need for God. So both of them point to God in a different way. So it reminds me of two verses that Paul writes in 2 Corinthians. First of all, you know this one in chapter 12, he says to this. He said to me, he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power, some versions say my power, is perfected in weakness. It means God said, my power, as God's power, is perfected, Paul, in your weakness. Most gladly, says Paul, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I'm well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So the weaker we are, the greater the chance to show by contrast the great power of God in our lives, even now. And a few chapters earlier, he said this. He said, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, he means our bodies, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not from ourselves. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Listen to this part. Always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. Now, Paul wasn't talking primarily about sickness, he was talking about persecution, but the principle is true wherever there's bodily weakness, and it's still true for us. So more on this next week, and how it all connects, and hopefully it will be an encouragement to you, and see you next week.